nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome back to Planet America. Here in the fake Oval Office, I'm John Barron.
And apparently levitating over a fake Yarra River, I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure spending spree is about a lot more than roads and bridges.
And Georgia's new voting laws are about a lot more than election fraud.
Meanwhile, America is losing its religion and televangelists are warning us about zombies.
And the high-profile Republican congressman is under investigation for sex trafficking. It is just another week on Planet America.
Last week, President Biden unveiled details of his $2 trillion jobs and infrastructure plan, just weeks after securing the passage of a $1.9 trillion economic relief package. The new mega bill, badged the American Jobs Plan, is not short on ambition.
I'm proposing a plan for the nation that rewards work, not just rewards wealth. It builds a fair economy that gives everybody a chance to succeed. And it's going to create the strongest, most resilient, innovative economy in the world.
It allocates over $620 billion for transport infrastructure, everything from highways, bridges and roads to airports, seaports, electric vehicles, public transport, railways. $650 billion as well is going towards what's called infrastructure at home, including high-speed internet, electricity grids, affordable housing and clean drinking water. The care economy channels $400 billion into home and community-based care for the elderly and disabled people. And there's another big wad of cash, $580 billion for research and development, manufacturing and small business programs. And President Biden admits he is going big.
Not a plan that tinkers around the edges. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America, unlike anything we've seen or done since we built the interstate highway system and the space race decades ago.
And how's he going to pay for all of that? He's going to make business pay. Biden wants the company tax rate to go up to 28%. He wants a global minimum tax rate of 21%. And he plans to scrap tax breaks for fossil fuel companies. And after 15 years, he'll have paid off that $2 trillion. So, how about it, Mitch?
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says there's no chance Republicans would support tax hikes to pay for President Biden's infrastructure plan.
Oh well, but here's the thing. Joe Biden does not need any Republican support. He can use the same budget reconciliation process he used to pass the COVID bill to pass the jobs plan with a simple majority of 51 Senate votes. Ordinarily, you can only pass one budget reconciliation bill a year, but Democrats got a second free shot, kind of a freebie, because Congress didn't pass a budget last year. So that's two. And until now, we thought that was all Biden could do this year without 60 votes to break a filibuster. But this week, there was some very good news from our old friend, the Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, Chaz.
Yes, on this occasion, the gift that she's bearing is the news that a revised budget resolution may contain budget reconciliation instructions. Hang on, what? Sorry, that means that they can implement multiple reconciliation bills per year. Sorry, what? Okay, that means that there is at least one extra occasion in which the Senate can pass legislation by a simple majority vote and bypass that 60-vote requirement to break the filibuster. Yet another freebie, that means, John. But it's not over yet. Firstly, Republicans have been creating quite a stink over the fact that less than 6% of this so-called infrastructure bill is going to roads and bridges. And in fact, more money is being spent just on electric cars than on roads, bridges, ports, airports and waterways combined. Now, personally, electric cars sounds to me like transport infrastructure. But yes, elderly care is a little less infrastructure-y. And Democrats have been pretty cheeky, tweeting out things like, paid leave is infrastructure and caregiving is infrastructure. But this is the way that Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg defends the bill.
Good infrastructure planning is always about looking to the future. You know, railroads weren't part of infrastructure until we built them. You know, I'm sure in the Eisenhower area, they weren't thinking about things like broadband. They were still working on electrification, which would have sounded newfangled in its time. Now it's time to prepare for the future. And the millions of jobs that will be created by this bill are because this bill looks to the future.
That guy was born to joust on Fox News. But forget the spin. This bill has maths problems as well. Biden's making a big deal out of trying to pay for it, possibly because the crucial 50th vote of Joe Manchin depends on it being paid for. But right off the bat, they need to employ funny math to get there. As it is, the $2.3 trillion worth of spending is going to take place over 8 years. But as John said, the balance of books, they're counting on 15 years worth of taxation. But then Joe Manchin even poked a hole in the funny math because he said he'd vote against Biden's proposal to raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, preferring it to be 25% for some reason. And he reckons 6 or 7 Democrats agree with him. Okay, maybe pay for it over 20 years? But then some other Democrats came over the top and they said they don't like that the 2017 Trump tax cuts limited state and local tax deductions to $10,000. That is bad news for rich New Yorkers and Californians who pay big property taxes. So these Democrats say they're not going to back any other tax code changes to fund the bill unless that tax deductions cap is removed. And they say they have the numbers to block the bill. Now, this seemingly minor change would actually cost $89 billion a year, or about 2/3 of the bill's revenue. And more than half of that change's benefits would actually help those earning over $1 million a year. Way to go, the people's champions. And if that's not bad enough, Joe Manchin is now hinting he might not back any reconciliation bill at all. He says there is no circumstance in which I will vote to eliminate or weaken the filibuster, adding, I simply do not believe budget reconciliation should replace regular legislation. Now that sounds ominous, extremely ominous until you see the disclaimer. Republicans, however, have a responsibility to stop saying no. So there is some wiggle room there. The problem is, it's not just Manchin. Another Democratic Senator, Kirsten Sinema, says, I don't think the solution is to erode the rules. I think the solution is for senators to change their behaviour and begin to work together. Lovely sentiment, but do they mean it? Or are they just playing games? We're going to find out soon enough. But if not, this lifeline from Republican Senator Roy Blunt might start to become a little more relevant.
I also think it would be an easy victory if we go back and look at roads and bridges and ports and airports and maybe even underground water systems and broadband. You'd still be talking about less than 30% of this entire package, and it's a easily doable 30%, I think.
Now, John, that's a long, long way from what Joe Biden wants, but it might be all he can get.
Yes, and we'll see if suddenly we've got a whole bunch of airports, roads and bridges being built in, I don't know, West Virginia and Arizona. So, what happens next? And will this new loophole in Senate rules be the key to Joe Biden's legislative future? Joining us is Jim Manley. He's a former top advisor to Democrat Harry Reid when he was Senate Majority Leader, and before that he worked for Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the last great wheelers and dealers of the Senate. Jim Manley, welcome back to Planet America.
Thanks for having me on again, John.
The reconciliation option that the Senate parliamentarian has now given the all clear, was this something that was always kind of quietly known or understood, or is this a whole brand new loophole that's been identified?
I've been involved in budget issues for an awful long time, John, a little more than 25 or so years. I'd never heard of it, quite frankly. So kudos to the staffers who discovered it. But I got to tell you, there's still a lot of questions about how it's going to be used, when they can use it, and whether, in fact, they should use it. So we'll have to wait and see. It's always great to have options, but I think we're a little bit a ways from Senator Schumer making a final decision about how to proceed.
Now, presumably, if you can amend one reconciliation bill, you can amend them all. And the Democrats had, I think, 3 potential reconciliation bills in 2 years. So would that mean that they actually have 6 potential reconciliation bills in total available to them? Is that right?
Actually, it's 5. There's at least 3 over the next 2 years and the maximum of 5. Everyone always forgets that we in this country, we need to take a stupid vote every year or so to raise the debt limit as well. So, but let's just agree it's at least 3 and as many as 5. But again, I got to tell you guys, there's no such things as free shots in the United States Senate, at least not with Mitch McConnell. And so what comes around goes around. And so if we're going to exploit this rule, and I think we should get to the bottom of it, I can assure you Senator McConnell is going to try and do the same thing as well.
So, Jim, would you say that this option on reconciliation is one of these tactics that is probably better not used, just keep it in your back pocket as a plan B in negotiations?
Yeah, good question, but the answer to that is no. That's not going to work because there are no Republicans going to vote for any of this stuff, period, end of story, which is why President Biden was smart enough, much to my surprise, to utilize it the first time around instead of engaging in worthless negotiations that were going to lead nowhere. Something, again, I saw firsthand when I worked for the former majority leader, Harry Reid, when we were trying to negotiate with McConnell and Barack Obama. Mitch McConnell's idea of a deal bears no relationship to anything that Democrats are looking for. So again, I get what you're asking, but no, it's not going to force Republicans to the table. What it's going to do, Chaz, I got to tell you. So I can see, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I can see us passing this next infrastructure bill. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. It's going to take a few months. But I got to tell you, I've detected a little bit of a sense of spending fatigue, if you will, on Capitol Hill with both Democrats and Republicans who are beginning to realize, how much all of these bills are adding up to the deficit.
Now, Jim, you spoke about some of the limitations of reconciliation. I believe in the last reconciliation bill, the parliamentarian wouldn't actually let them use it for specific projects, something that would be a huge issue for an infrastructure bill, I would have thought. So is that the kind of detail that you think might be about to surprise the Democrats?
It, as always, the devil's in the details. And we don't have a lot of detail yet about what exactly the parliamentarian, who, by the way, is a good person, straight as an arrow, there's real question about what exactly she's going to allow. And Chaz, and as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the left is going to have to they're going to find out, if they don't know already, that everything they want is not going to be possible if and when the Democratic leaders decide to utilize this option. The broad sweeping, a lot of broad sweeping proposals in a weird but true category actually have no impact on spending, direct impact, on spending, and ergo it's going to be ruled out of order. And I do not, and yes, there are some on the left that are demanding that if that happens, just overrule the parliamentarian and force her to change her ruling. But I'm telling you, folks, that's not going to happen.
Jim Manley, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, guys.
Last week, the New York Times sensationally reported Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, a vocal ally of Donald Trump, is being investigated by the Justice Department over whether he had a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old and paid for her to travel with him. The Times noted it is illegal to induce somebody under 18 to travel over state lines to engage in sex in exchange for money or something of value, and offenders often receive severe sentences. Hours after that story dropped, Gaetz popped up on the Tucker Carlson show on Fox News, and Tucker began with a bit of a disclaimer.
We have no background on it all, and not even any very informed questions.
Gaetz then went on to deny the claim and made an extraordinary counterclaim. The investigation, he says, is a part of a $25 million extortion bid by a former Department of Justice lawyer.
I have not had a relationship with a 17-year-old. That is totally false. The allegation, as I read it in the New York Times, is that I've traveled with some 17-year-old in some relationship. That is false, and records will bear that out to be false.
Gaetz then identified the lawyer as David McGee, who doesn't seem like your typical Florida shakedown artist.
McGee's law firm, Beggs & Lane, released a statement denying the accusations against him. The allegation by the congressman is both false and defamatory. Mr. McGee was the chief United States attorney for the Northern District of Florida 25 years ago. During his tenure with the Department of Justice, his reputation for integrity and ethical conduct was impeccable.
Meanwhile, back on Tucker Carlson's show, things were getting a little bit awkward.
I'm not the only person on screen right now who's been falsely accused of a terrible sex act. You were accused of something that you did not do, and so you know what this feels like.
That was possibly a reference to an allegation that Carlson wrote about in his 2003 book, Politicians, Partisans and Parasites.
You just referred to a mentally ill viewer who accused me of a sex crime 20 years ago. And of course, it was not true. I'd never met the person. But I do agree with you that being accused falsely is one of the worst things that can happen. And you do see it a lot.
Actually, statistically, it doesn't happen very much at all. But the woman who made that claim, Kimberly Carter, also now says they never met. It was a misunderstanding brought on by a mental health condition. She was delusional at the time, she says. Although Tucker Carlson was also among 3 Fox News hosts accused of sexual harassment, another accused of rape last year by 2 Fox reporters. One of them, Kathy Aru, alleged in federal court filings that Tucker Carlson implicitly invited her back to his hotel room for sex in 2018 and refused to have her on his show after she turned down his advances. That case is still pending, and Matt Gaetz knows that. Was that what he was referring to? But still, he then seemed to imply that Tucker had also met the woman at the centre of the claims against him.
I can say that actually you and I went to dinner about 2 years ago. Your wife was there, and I brought a friend of mine, you'll remember her, and she was actually threatened by the FBI, told that if she wouldn't cop to the fact that somehow I was involved in some pay-for-play scheme, that she could face trouble.
Tucker then said he didn't remember the woman. It all got a bit weird, and after the interview, he summed it up this way.
That was one of the weirdest interviews I've ever conducted.
Agreed. And after that performance, Matt Gaetz wasn't exactly getting full-throated support from his fellow Republicans.
This morning, the investigation into whether Congressman Matt Gaetz had a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old sending shockwaves through Washington. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy saying if those allegations turn out to be true, Gaetz will lose his committee assignments.
Those are serious implications. If it comes out to be true, yes, we would remove him if that was the case. But right now, as Matt Gaetz says, it is not true, and we don't have any information. So let's get all the information.
Good idea. The Justice Department, which began their investigation last year, is remaining tight-lipped, but some members of Congress are not.
Multiple sources are telling us that Gaetz bragged about his sexual escapades to his colleagues in Congress, even allegedly showing off photos and videos of nude women he said he had slept with to other lawmakers.
So, the guy sounds like a real creep, but is he a creep who broke the law? We don't yet know. There is a lot of talk about Gaetz taking illegal drugs. The New York Times also reports that a friend of Gaetz, Joel Greenberg, a former Florida politician, now under indictment himself for sex trafficking and other crimes, recruited women online, paid cash for sex and introduced those women to Matt Gaetz, who also had sex with them. Did Gaetz avoid making illegal payments, though, by having Greenberg pick up the tab? Did Gaetz commit other crimes with a minor? Were there political favours exchanged? We don't know. But we do know he reportedly asked the Trump White House for blanket preemptive pardons for himself and unidentified congressional allies for any crimes they may have committed. And we also know he is still sitting on the House Judiciary Committee with oversight of the very Justice Department that is investigating him and several of his friends. Donald Trump has been rather conspicuously quiet so far about Gaetz this week, although Trump's longtime political advisor Roger Stone, pictured here with Gaetz and Greenberg in 2017, called the allegations a, quote, smear on conservative Twitter substitute Parler. Finally, yesterday, President Trump issued a statement saying Congressman Matt Gaetz has never asked me for a pardon. It must also be remembered that he has totally denied the accusations against him, which, given Trump's tendency to claim fake news and witch hunts, does seem a little bit tepid. Basically, Chaz, he seems to be saying, well, he says he's innocent.
Yeah, Trump very sensibly and rarely laying low there. Now, there's a lot of distracting colour and movement in this story. Back when Gaetz was in the Florida legislature, we heard he supposedly came up with some weird sexual conquest games, and when they passed a revenge porn bill one day, Gaetz was just one of 2 votes against it. Apparently, Gaetz was of the view that if someone sends you a nude pic, you should be able to use it however you want. We also heard that Gaetz was literally the only vote in Congress against an anti-human trafficking bill that passed in 2017, although he says it was because he thought it involved an unconstitutional expansion of the federal government. The biggest distraction of all is, of course, these extortion claims that you refer to, John, but they appear to be at least partly true. The Washington Examiner got a hold of a bunch of texts and emails showing that someone had messaged Gaetz' dad a few weeks back saying they had a plan to make Gaetz' future legal and political problems go away. Well, what was that plan? For Gaetz or for someone else to pay for an operation to free a hostage. Robert Levinson, his name was, and he's stuck in Iran. And if that worked, Gaetz would be given credit for facilitating the release of the hostage. Okay, so how does that help Gaetz? They said the hostage delivery team would strongly advocate that Biden issue a pardon for Gaetz or terminate any investigations of him. Now, that sounds like fairyland stuff to me, but they appear to be real messages at the very least. And Gaetz also had a letter from the FBI showing his dad was working with them to catch these guys. So, is that all extortion or bribery or nothing? I'm not sure, to be honest, but either way, it does have absolutely zero to do with whether Gaetz committed a crime in the first place. So let's straighten up. This investigation opened during the Trump administration under Bill Barr, and he apparently knew all about it. So unlike what Gaetz claims, the investigation is probably not political. Furthermore, the New York Times has seen receipts of payments from Gaetz to one of the women involved, and the women supposedly told their friends that the payments were for sex. But that doesn't mean you can prove they were. Gaetz says, I have definitely in my single days paid for flights, for hotel rooms. I've been, generous as a partner. That's all he's guilty of. Generosity. He also denies having had sex with any 17-year-old ever as an adult. Maybe. Let's see what the FBI come up with. Right now, the only thing we know for sure is that this ad last week declaring that the office of Matt Gaetz seeks interns is probably not going to yield a lot of applicants, John.
One would hope not, Chaz. And bad news for Matt Gaetz today as well, that his co-accused, who's currently under indictment, is helping the FBI and maybe giving evidence against Matt Gaetz. So that's never a good sign. Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp, meanwhile, has signed into law sweeping changes to the state's electoral system. This follows unfounded claims, of course, of voter fraud in last November's presidential election and again in January's Georgia Senate runoff elections, all of which, of course, were won narrowly by Democrats.
It requires a photo ID for absentee ballot by mail. It limits the time to request an absentee ballot and ballot drop box locations. It replaces the Secretary of State as the election board chair with an appointee. It allows the election board to replace election officials in underperforming counties. It reduces runoff election length, and it bars outside groups from handing out food or water to people in voting lines.
The head of the nonpartisan civil rights group, the NAACP in Georgia, the Reverend James Woodall, says this law is aimed at making it harder for African Americans in particular to vote, and thus reminiscent of post-Civil War Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised black voters.
When we talk about Jim Crow was a series of acts that on its face did not look consequential at all, but in analysis and evaluation of the impact it has, particularly within communities of color, in the African American community in specifics, that this creates a disparate experience as it relates to the franchise of elections and democracy and voting in this country. And so that's why we've called it Jim Crow 2.0, because one, it's a 98-page bill with thousands upon thousands of lines of quote-unquote reforms that, again, quote-unquote, addresses voter confidence and voter integrity, but in actuality is really a campaign of sorts to reduce the amount of African Americans and people of color from being able to access the ballot in an easy and accessible way.
Is it possible, Reverend, to quantify the net effect of all of these measures? Georgia, obviously, very, very close. Joe Biden won it narrowly. 2 Democrats narrowly won it as well in special Senate elections in January. Would this law have meant that Republicans would have won?
Well, I know what is fact is that several members of the General Assembly who pushed this legislation signed on to several lawsuits trying to overturn elections, trying to stop the certification of the election from the U.S. president or the U.S. senator or even local elections. None of them tried to overturn their own elections that they were, on the ballot for. We have sitting members of Congress. One who's now said he's running for Secretary of State signed onto a lawsuit saying that there was voter fraud and that there should not have been a certification of President Joe Biden as the 45th or 46th president of the United States. And so that's the pretext of why we're here. These are attacks against our democracy, and everybody should be alarmed, regardless of partisan affiliation, because if Democrats were doing it, we would be just as outraged, and we would be just as invested in ensuring that this does not happen ever again. Because again, we have no permanent friends or enemies. We only have a permanent interest, and that's the liberation of all people. And the only way we can liberate our people is if they're all able to participate in this thing called democracy.
And President Biden has also joined the chorus of concern.
This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do, and it cannot be sustained.
Jim Eagle? But Governor Kemp says Georgia's laws are actually less restrictive than many states, including Biden's own home state of Delaware.
We have a lot more opportunities for people to vote early here in the great state of Georgia than in Delaware, and perhaps people will compare those. This bill that I just signed, is expanding the opportunity for people to vote.
Look, let's put the Jim Crow references to one side and let's pretend we never heard the term Jim Eagle while we go a little bit deeper in on the detail. Georgia's new law reduces the time you can request a mail-in ballot from 180 days before the election to 77 days before the election. Not sure that's a big deal in itself. Instead of returning your mail-in ballot by the Friday before an election, though, you now have to return it a week earlier. They say that's so no ballots arrive late anymore. And when you send in your mail-in ballot, you do now need some kind of ID, as described before, either a driver's license number or a state ID number of some kind, or acceptable ID that you can get for free. Whereas they used to just require your signature. Now, those conditions certainly restrict mail-in voting a little. I would argue not a massive amount, but the most important thing is that anyone in Georgia can still request a mail-in ballot for any reason. You do not require a special excuse, which is more than I can say for any of these 16 states, including New York, and including, as they said before, the president's home state of Delaware. Next, we've heard a lot about restrictions on early voting under this law, but the new law says early voting runs for 17 days with the option of 19 days, when until now, the law said 16 days, so they've expanded it. By the way, in New York, they have 9 days of early voting. But how about early voting hours? Well, actually, the hours have been expanded slightly as well in some places. The new law would add an additional mandatory Saturday for voting, and it would mandate that early voting must run for at least from 9 to 5 at minimum, and possibly as long as 7 to 7, which means if you live in a metropolitan area, it would probably be the same as it was before. For rural counties, early voting hours would likely be longer. Essentially, Democrats have, in my view, maybe disingenuously taken the minimum requirements in this law and acted like they are the mandates, like they're a restriction. They are not. The urban areas can do exactly as they did in the 2020 election. Then there are the drop boxes for your mail-in ballots. The new law mandates 1 drop box per county, but it restricts where those drop boxes can be placed. Makes them only accessible during early voting hours, which kind of defeats the purpose of after-hours drop boxes, and they were available 24/7 during the 2020 election. Although importantly, drop boxes weren't even part of the law until now. The 2020 election was a one-off. Still, they are definitely restrictive, at least slightly. And we've also heard about the water restriction, where people are banned from handing out food and water to voters in line and within 150 feet of the voting building. Now, importantly, poll workers can hand out food and water still. And there are ways for third parties to make food and water available for self-service. But while this probably isn't a big deal, it's still a bit over the top as a way of supposedly stopping untoward campaigning. Having said that, there's actually a really good bit in the new law. If queues get longer than an hour, those precincts now have to take action. And before the next election, they need to either hire more staff or split up the precinct. Now, I know that's all about the next election, but over time, that would make an actual difference to encouraging urban voting, which is good. So, does that all mean then that this law is wonderful? No, definitely not. In America, you need to vote at the right precinct. If you vote at the wrong precinct, they make you fill out what they call a provisional ballot. Now, under this law, if you go to the wrong precinct before 5 p.m, they'll tell you to go to the right precinct instead of giving you a provisional ballot. They make you line up again. And that could really discourage some votes. How many votes? There were 8,200 provisional votes in Georgia because people went to the wrong locations in the 2020 election. 8,200. Final margin in the 2020 election in Georgia? 11,000 votes. So that could really make a huge difference. Also, after the Secretary of State in Georgia stood up to Trump's garbage about the election being stolen, they have now not only removed the Secretary of State as chair of the state election board, they've made it so the Georgia General Assembly appoints the state election board, basically giving control to the Republican state legislature, and that board can suspend county superintendents. So what does that all mean? It means that after the Secretary of State did his job, Georgia Republicans have punished him. They've taken away some of his power, given it to some of their flunkies, and those flunkies are now running the election board and can punish urban election superintendents if they don't like what's going on. So this bill is not Jim Crow or Jim Eagle, whatever that means, but spin and hype aside, it really doesn't bode well, in my view, for the future of Georgia elections, John.
Well, let's try and cut through some of the spin and some of the hype and get a sense of the broader historical context as well. To do that, we're joined by Dr. Adrienne Jones, a lawyer and expert on voting rights. She's assistant professor at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Adrienne Jones, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
Your governor there, Brian Kemp, says that these new laws are not Jim Crow 2.0. It actually expands access to the ballot. Is he right?
He does say that. I would say that he is incorrect. The new omnibus bill, SB 202, adds a lot of changes to the law that will likely make it more challenging for people to get to the polls. We just concluded a safe, secure, diverse, accessible election that for the presidential spot involved 2 recounts of the original count. So there is, number one, no reason for the law to be changing. And number 2, the changes to the law seem designed and pointed to prevent voters from the ease with which they were able to reach the polls in 2020.
Some, including the governor, have argued that a lot of the expanded voting access measures from last year in Georgia and elsewhere, more early voting, mail-in voting, drop boxes, were really just COVID-specific measures and are no longer needed. What do you say?
You know, they did open up, say, for example, absentee voting in Georgia as a result of COVID. But note that absentee voting is a Republican initiative from 2005. Those drop boxes go with absentee voting, and the number of drop boxes will be decreased in Metro Atlanta, and the drop boxes will be less accessible than they have been during COVID or in the past. So drop boxes have to be inside polling places or government buildings, and then they can only be accessed when those locations are open. Part of the benefit of an absentee drop box is that if I have to work and drop off my ballot at some strange hour, 2 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night, this is a method for me to do so. The fact that they are reducing the number of drop boxes and limiting their access, I think is very problematic.
Allow me to be devil's advocate for just a moment, Professor. Is it being disrespectful to the history of those who suffered under Jim Crow, where there were grandfather tests and literacy tests and poll taxes and election violence, even lynchings around elections, to compare what we're seeing today to all of that?
We have a slave and a Jim Crow history in the United States. The idea that it would be disrespectful to acknowledge that history strikes me as problematic. And, it is not that we are living during Jim Crow. But yes, these provisions do have similarities, right? If you have a strict voter ID law that requires people who don't have the specific ID that you're demanding pay money and make effort in order to, and use transportation in order to get the identification that they need, because they can no longer use an accessible form of ID, like a utility bill or some kind of ID that isn't specific. If we're talking about making up reasons to prevent people from being able to get into the polling place, this is what Jim Crow laws did.
During the civil rights era leading up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we didn't really see big business play a big role. They weren't out there desegregating their restrooms and their lunch counters. We are seeing businesses, though, now with Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola condemning Georgia's election laws, Major League Baseball moving a big game out of Atlanta as well. What's changed?
Today, because all people can vote, their legislators and companies have more of a sensitivity, I think, to the various diverse groups of people who want to be able to vote. And it's not like we're inundated with corporate model citizenship here. Right now we're talking about some very tame statements in our area from Coca-Cola and from Delta Airlines. Right now, the GOP leadership in my state is being extremely combative with them. My state house leader drank a Pepsi the other day. This is a huge deal in a Coke state, in a Coke city. They refused the regular shipment of free Coca-Cola to the state house. And they refused to pass a tax break that was going to benefit Delta. So it's looking like they're going to be sort of hard-nosed with regard to these businesses. At the same time, we are all clear in the United States that politics spends corporate money. So, if corporations become better and more robust in their opposition to discriminatory laws like SB 202, it stands to me to reason that state legislators will start to take notice and will not be so flamboyant about opposing them.
Dr. Adrienne Jones, many thanks indeed for being with us on Planet America.
You're very welcome.
And Chaz, Adrienne Jones there touched on the role that big businesses are playing protesting these new Georgia laws. Coca-Cola, which has its global headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, expressed its disappointment, although they did wait until the law had passed before they expressed that. Major League Baseball did pull an all-star game from Atlanta in protest. And Delta Airlines as well said they were not happy. And it was interesting that Mitch McConnell and Republicans then started threatening boycotts of Coca-Cola and started threatening boycotts of Delta Airlines and baseball and everything else. It's quite an interesting stage we've gotten to.
Yeah, even worse than a boycott, in Georgia, they actually took away a tax break from Delta Airlines. And they're talking about, in Congress, Republicans trying to basically bust the Major League Baseball with the antitrust law. So they're talking about actually punishing what is free speech. But it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario for some of these companies, because obviously they could get boycotted the other way from the left if they don't do it. So they're kind of betwixt and between. I noticed that the companies did go where the polling was. Morning Consult had 39 to 28% of people supporting the Major League Baseball pulling out of Georgia. In fact, out of baseball aficionados, it was 48% to 31%. So they went with the polling, but I do feel sorry for them.
Well, certainly baseball fans have voted with their feet. They turned out in droves at a match down in, or a game down in Texas. And it's interesting as well that maybe Major League Baseball wasn't taking such a principled stand, because the suggestion is that a bunch of players were going to boycott it if the game went ahead in Atlanta. But interesting as well, Mitch McConnell, he was a big fan of corporate free speech being expressed through dollars when the Citizens United case went through the US Supreme Court almost a decade ago, and got very toey when all of a sudden companies said, well, we're going to weigh into a political debate like this right now. Do you reckon it's a good thing for big business to be not just voting with their money, but to be also expressing an opinion on these topics?
Look, personally, I'd prefer business to stay out of this kind of stuff. Like, I don't think you want to see politics wherever you go all the time, but that's America at the moment, and big business is part of it, unfortunately for them.
Yep, always has been as well. Now, with many of us having celebrated Easter and Passover over the last few weeks, it's interesting to note that Americans are, to a large extent, losing their religion. A lot has been made about Joe Biden's age, his recent stumble, and his mental state.
All right, the ever-confused, confounded Joe Biden still stumbling toward the Democratic nomination.
The Biden people say he's fine.
Oh, he can't recite the Pledge of Allegiance and he's fine.
He was asked if he'd been tested for cognitive decline.
And a lot has also been made about Joe Biden's gaffes.
Now is the time to heed the timeless advice from Teddy Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick. End of quote. I promise you, the president has a big stick.
But not a lot has been made about Joe Biden's faith. If anything, he's the one who keeps bringing it up.
Faith is what has gotten me through difficult times in my life. I lost my wife and daughter. When my son had stage 4 glioblastoma, it was a matter of months. Personally, for me, faith, it's all about hope.
Biden is just the second Catholic to be elected president. That fact was barely a footnote during the campaign, but back in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running to be the first, it was a very big deal indeed. He had to convince some voters that he wouldn't be taking orders from the Pope.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act.
And not so long ago, more than 20% of the American population said they believed their first black president was Muslim, despite his professed Christian faith.
Redemption can be delivered by faith in Jesus Christ.
My faith as being both a personal commitment to Christ. Jesus Christ died for my sins.
This guy didn't help.
Imam Hussein Obama. I want to be fair, too. He probably is the best anti-American president the country's ever had.
And neither did this guy.
We problem in this country, it's called Muslims. We know our current president is one. Right. You know he's not even an American.
We need this
birth
question.
certificate, man. But anyway.
I'm saying it's a real possibility, much greater than I thought 2 or 3 weeks ago. Then he has pulled one of the great cons in the history of politics and beyond politics.
And it's fair to say Donald Trump's own religion is kind of hazy.
You know, when I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
He still managed to court the evangelical Christian vote, though.
Let's pray together, may we?
So, what is going on? One answer might be America is losing its religion.
Losing my religion.
Just over 70% of Americans identify as Christians, about 25% evangelical Protestants, 21% Catholic, 15% mainline Protestants, they're mostly Episcopalians and Methodists, and around 6% are members of historically black Protestant churches. Around 1.5% are Mormon, and under 1% are Jehovah's Witness. Around 6% of Americans hold a non-Christian faith. The rest, a mix of agnostic, atheist, and they're tricky to classify.
Jediism is a religion based on the observance of the Force.
Now, the Force is what gives the Jedi his power.
It's an energy field created by all living things.
But whatever Americans believe, they're less likely to be a member of an established church, synagogue, temple, mosque or tabernacle than they once were.
He had that old-time religion, he had that old-time religion, he had that old-time religion, and brother, it's good enough for me, my Lord.
The Gallup polling firm has been asking Americans about church membership since the 1930s, and after reaching a high point of 76% during World War II, it stayed pretty steady until the end of the century, then started trending down quickly, year by year, to around 50% today. During the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the proportion of Americans with a religion fell from 90% to 77%, while the number with no religion has jumped from 8 to 19%. Other data suggests there has been a greater decline in organised religion than in faith itself.
Because I gotta have faith.
20 years ago, 73% of religious people participated in some kind of religious organisation, like a church. That is now around 64%. And while 10% of people with no religion were still members of a faith group in the late 1990s, that slipped to 7% now.
Today is Sunday, the Lord's Day, and yet at this very moment, millions of Americans are not in the Lord's house. They're in their own house, worshiping a false idol, professional football.
And that is largely a generational thing. For Joe Biden's generation, born before 1945, church membership is still close to 70%, although that is down 9 points. The baby boomers, Generation X and millennials just aren't that interested. While 89% of those pre-boomers have a faith of some kind, just 68% of millennials do, and as the pre-boomer and boomer generation dies, faith numbers are going down. Although the coronavirus pandemic had an interesting impact on faith.
I demand a vaccination to come immediately.
Yes! In many parts of America, places of worship were closed for months on end last year, but for regular worshippers, almost half of them said their religious beliefs had actually strengthened.
I worship you, Lord. I worship you, God. I thank you for you are holy, 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 holy.
While there isn't much data on other religions, we do know the decline in Christian church membership is uneven. Catholics have left the church at twice the rate of Protestants over the past 20 years. Fewer men than women are going to church. The two groups with the largest decline, Hispanics and Democrats. And that's linked to the fall in Catholic numbers overall as well. So maybe that's a clue as to why Joe Biden's Catholicism is just not a big issue. Overall, religion is less important, and unlike 1960, nobody really thinks the Catholic Church is expanding its influence anymore.
Now, before the break, we told you America was in a tricky place with the numbers of people either sneaking over the southern border or claiming asylum there. And we were right. The March provisional numbers are out, and there were about 170,000 encounters on the southern border. That's up about 70% from February, and blowing out of the water the previous decade-long high from 2019. Note, those numbers tend to keep rising until May, so it's going to get worse. As for unaccompanied kids, the numbers basically doubled since February and also reached a decade-long high. So this is a problem. How much of a problem? This is the Donner facility, the largest destination for newly arrived children. Ted Cruz grabbed this footage without permission and snuck it out. There are more than 4,000 kids staying in this facility, even though it was intended for only 250. More than half the kids here, 2,000 of them, have been there for longer than the legally allowed 72 hours. And more than 1,200 of the kids have been processed and are waiting to be sent to a better, more permanent facility, except there isn't one, because they're all full. And every problem we told you about 2 weeks ago is now worse. They now have sections in the facilities for the unaccompanied babies that are starting to turn up. You might wonder how exactly babies and toddlers are getting there if they're unaccompanied. Well, here is a rather depressing illustration. This is infrared footage of two people smugglers dropping first a 3-year-old and then a 5-year-old over the wall onto the ground and then just leaving them there and running off. This is what America is now dealing with. We told you before about how a few asylum seekers were now just being released into the community without even a court date to hear their application. Well, now there's 2,000 of them being released without a court date, essentially relying on those people to follow up themselves and harass the bureaucracy until they get a hearing. Sometimes it goes even further and they're released without any paperwork whatsoever. The numbers pressure on the bureaucracy is just too intense, and they are just the people who are apprehended. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 people a day are thought to be sneaking in without even being identified or apprehended. Who are those people? Presumably, they're mostly people looking for work. But then you hear about 2 more Yemeni men who were arrested in the last 2 months on the border who are also identified on the terror watch list. And you might think, this isn't ideal. Yes, it's just 2 people in 2 months, but still, none of this is ideal. John, please tell us something a little bit more lighthearted and take us to...
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And have we got some malarkey for you? This week it's all about zombies.
Zombies that are on the earth are a disease like any other disease that affects people, and they become like zombies. Is that right?
The man asking that rather pertinent question is the Reverend Jim Bakker. Now, if you're about my age or older, you may remember Jim Bakker as one of the shonkiest televangelists of the 1980s. Reverend Bakker paid his secretary Jessica Hahn $250,000 in hush money after she accused him of drugging and raping her. He was later jailed for 5 years for ripping off his ministry and his parishioners. He's got a new TV show. But back to the zombies.
Zombies also have the evil spiritual entity known as demon possession, okay?
Okay. That is Steve Quayle, who describes himself as a, quote, nationally known radio host, photographer, and author of a number of important books. And who is described as a right-wing conspiracy theorist by watchdog groups.
The best way to explain zombies' bloodlust is this: the appetite of demons expressed through humans. It should be astonishing to people that the richest people in the world, not all of them, but some of them, are into occult ceremonies where they have to drink, blood that's extracted from a tortured child. Now that's sick.
Yes, it is. And so is Jim Bakker's prediction that if Trump lost the election, America's church leaders would all be killed.
You're going to see them suddenly die, suddenly killed, suddenly as they were driving, suddenly as they were in a boat, suddenly in an airplane. You're going to see one after. God spoke to me this years ago what would happen near the end.
Jim Bakker is constantly peddling the idea of an impending apocalypse with or without zombies, but with plenty of overpriced survivalist products.
If the power goes out, we believe in being ready for anything.
I guess you'd say, Jim and Lori, help me be prepared today.
I don't feel at all prepared for that. Jim Bakker was sued last year for selling fake COVID cures.
We've tested it. It works on just about everything. This influenza that is now circling the globe, you're saying that silver solution would be effective.
Well, let's say it hasn't been tested on this strain of the coronavirus, but it's been tested on other strains of the coronavirus and has been able to eliminate it within 12 hours.
No, that's wrong. That was a step too far for regulators. But everything else, talk of the end times, all the books, all the DVDs, all the appeals for millions of dollars in donations, all of that is protected free speech under the US Constitution. And that is much scarier than a bunch of zombies. It's malarkey, Chaz.
But now for a quick update on a far less glamorous yet sadly real disease, COVID. And even though the new cases have basically been steady for 6 weeks, the daily deaths are down to their lowest levels since October. The reason for that? Probably vaccines. 33% of Americans, and importantly 75% of seniors, have now had at least 1 dose. And they're going at about 3 million doses a day now. So at this rate, 75% of people are expected to be fully vaccinated by July. Herd immunity, here we come, toot toot. The problem though is that variants are spreading at about the same rate. The super contagious British variant is now the most common strain in America of all of them, and where it sets roots, it kind of takes off. That's why 5 states account for about 43% of America's cases at the moment. Florida, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and especially Michigan, where 9 of the worst 10 metro areas are currently located. But deaths are still going down nationally because most of those old people who are the ones most vulnerable to death are vaccinated. So America's kind of seen a 4th surge in a way right now, but it's having much less impact, at least so far. So that is good news to go out on, John.
Fingers crossed. Before we go, some sad news that the Australian-born Apollo program astronaut Dr. Philip Chapman died in Arizona this week at the age of 86. In what we believe was his final interview in the ABC documentary Fly Me to the Moon about the Apollo program a couple of years ago. He had a lot of fascinating things to say. We'll repeat that show for you this Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC News, and it's on iView as well. Do you have anything to plug at all, Chaz?
Actually, no. We don't have a podcast today. I could plug some comedy shows from Melbourne. Probably inappropriate on the ABC though, so no. I'll see you back in the Foval office at the same time next week when I get out of the Yarra River.
Yeah, this is no place for comedy. Good night.